The old rancher had become the town's favorite joke. His wrinkled face, slow walk, and loyal old dog were the perfect symbols of a life that seemed to have lost its meaning. They said he was chasing ghosts in that forgotten canyon, clinging to the past like dust on worn boots. Yet behind those silent eyes lived a man who carried something no one else could see, a story buried deeper than the gold the Apaches once hid, and a bond with his dog that ran stronger than blood or time itself. Every morning, he'd ride his mule down the same dry path, the wind whispering through dead mesquite trees, the dog trotting close by. People laughed from their porches, calling him the ghost rancher, but he never answered. He didn't need to, because the canyon remembered. Beneath its layers of stone and silence, it guarded a truth only loyalty could uncover, and the old rancher had never broken his word. One evening, when the sun bled red across the cliffs, the dog began to bark, digging furiously at a patch of rock near the edge of an ancient trail. The rancher's tired eyes widened as something glimmered beneath the dust, a faint trace of metal, hand-carved and older than any map the town ever drew. His heart raced, not for riches, but for what it meant. The legends weren't lies. The land he'd been mocked for loving had finally spoken back. The next morning, those who had laughed came riding to see for themselves. But when they reached the canyon, they found the old man's hat resting on a stone, his dog sitting beside it, guarding the discovery with the same quiet strength his master had shown all his life. None of them laughed anymore. They just stood there, watching the sunrise spill over the land they never truly understood. That day, the canyon reclaimed its silence, but its story began to spread beyond the dust. People spoke of the rancher who believed when no one else would, and of the faithful dog who uncovered an Apache treasure not of gold, but of legacy. It wasn't about what they found. It was about what they proved, that faith, loyalty, and heart are worth more than every fortune buried beneath the desert. The town of Dry Creek had always been small, but gossip traveled faster than a wild horse. When word spread that the old rancher's dog had found something buried in the canyon, curiosity began to burn through every saloon and stable. Men who once mocked him suddenly wanted to know every detail. They spoke his name with forced respect, pretending they had always admired him. But those who truly knew the man remembered his silence, the way he'd tip his hat to strangers and never raise his voice. He didn't crave attention. He craved truth, and the land had finally chosen to speak through him. As the canyon story grew, a few locals decided to ride out and see what was left behind. The sun was ruthless, painting their faces in sweat and grit as they reached the edge of that hollow valley. There, they found the old man's dog still guarding the site, lying next to a pile of disturbed earth. The dog didn't bark or run. It simply looked at them, eyes deep and steady, as if judging whether they were worthy to come closer. Something about that look made even the roughest cowboy hesitate. There was power there, something sacred in the dust. When one of them finally dared to kneel and brush the ground, a strange pattern appeared, symbols carved into stone, faint but deliberate. "Apache," whispered one man, voice trembling. The markings told a story of protection, loyalty, and the burial of something not meant for greedy hands. It was then that the men realized this wasn't gold. It was history. What the old rancher had found was far more valuable than any treasure, a relic of trust between a forgotten tribe and the land itself. Still, greed has a way of crawling into the human heart. That night, as darkness blanketed Dry Creek, a few men gathered in the saloon, whispering plans over whiskey glasses. They didn't care about history or loyalty. They wanted what they thought was hidden beneath those stones. The canyon had taken lives before, but that didn't matter to them. In their minds, if an old fool and his dog could find something precious, then surely it was meant to be stolen. The next morning, the same men rode out under a pale dawn. The dog was still there, watching. They dismounted and approached with shovels, their boots crunching against the gravel. The wind seemed to howl louder the closer they got, almost warning them to turn back. But men blinded by greed seldom listened to the wind or to ghosts. When their tools struck the earth, something shifted in the air, heavy and sharp, like the breath before a storm. As the first shovelful of dirt lifted from the sacred ground, the canyon began to echo. It wasn't the sound of thunder, but of something older, something alive in the stone. The men froze, glancing at each other with unease. The dog began to growl low, its fur bristling as the wind turned cold. One of them cursed under his breath, trying to laugh it off, but his voice cracked halfway through. "Ain't no ghosts here," he muttered. But the canyon seemed to disagree. Suddenly, the ground trembled lightly, just enough to send a warning. The loose stones from above rolled down in a slow, rhythmic fall, like the land breathing in disapproval. Fear began to creep in, but pride kept them digging. Then one man's shovel struck metal again, this time deeper, sharper. They hurried, clearing away dust until they found a small chest, covered in rust and bound with rope that looked centuries old. The symbols carved on it matched those on the stones around them. None of them knew what they meant, but instinct whispered that it should be left alone. Ignoring that instinct, one man pulled out his knife and cut the rope. As soon as the seal broke, a sudden gust blew through the canyon, strong enough to knock hats off and extinguish their lanterns. The dog barked furiously, circling the chest as if trying to protect it from them. Inside, instead of gold, there were bones, human bones, wrapped in faded cloth and painted with red dust. Silence fell heavy as realization struck. This wasn't treasure. It was a grave. For the first time, the men felt shame. One of them dropped his shovel and stepped back, mumbling something about curses and dishonor. The dog stopped barking and sat still, its eyes fixed on the bones as if it understood what lay before them. Slowly, the wind softened again, carrying the faint echo of drums, distant, ancient, and mournful. The canyon wasn't a place of riches. It was a sanctuary. The old rancher hadn't been chasing gold. He'd been protecting a promise. That night, the men returned to Dry Creek pale and shaken. No one spoke of what they found. But by morning, stories began to spread anyway, about ghosts, curses, and the loyal dog that still guarded the canyon alone. Some swore they saw a figure on horseback riding under the moonlight, beside the same dog, heading deeper into the shadows. Whether it was the old rancher or the spirit of the land itself, no one knew. But one thing became clear. The canyon didn't belong to man. It belonged to memory. Days turned into weeks, and though the men from Dry Creek avoided the canyon, others began to arrive. Treasure hunters, outlaws, and drifters, all lured by the whisper of something hidden beneath the desert stones. They came with metal detectors, shovels, and guns, believing they could take what the old rancher had discovered. The town sheriff tried to warn them. "That land don't take kindly to greed," he said, but his words meant little to men blinded by the promise of fortune. They laughed, just as others had once laughed at the old rancher. But one night, a storm rolled over the canyon unlike any seen before. Lightning tore through the sky, lighting the rocks in a red glow that looked almost alive. The wind screamed through the cliffs like 1,000 voices calling out in warning. When the storm passed, the newcomers were gone. No horses, no campfires, no trace but the sound of the dog howling somewhere deep inside the canyon. It was a sound that chilled even the bravest heart, a reminder that some places remember every trespass. After that night, the people of Dry Creek began to change. The saloons grew quieter, the laughter softer. When someone mentioned the canyon, they did so in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb whatever slept there. The old rancher's cabin, once a decaying shack at the edge of town, became a place of reverence. Folks started leaving offerings at the gate, pieces of bread, silver coins, even old photos, small gestures of respect for the man they once mocked. The dog would appear sometimes, sitting by the porch, its fur gray from dust, eyes calm but knowing. Children would whisper that it was guarding not just the canyon, but the town itself. Some believed it waited for its master to return. Others said it was his spirit reborn. Either way, no one dared chase it off. In the silence of the desert, the animal had become more than a pet. It was a living reminder that faith, even when laughed at, carries a strength time cannot break. And as the seasons turned, the canyon bloomed once more. Wildflowers began to grow along the trails, and the wind carried a gentler song through the ravine. It was as if the land itself had forgiven, so long as no one dared to disturb it again. Those who passed through could feel it, the pulse of something eternal beneath the soil, where man, beast, and spirit had bound themselves through belief and loyalty. Years later, a young historian rode into Dry Creek, drawn by the legend. He had heard stories in towns far away of the ghost rancher and his loyal dog who found an Apache treasure and vanished in a myth. Most dismissed it as folklore, but the historian was different. He believed that stories, even the wildest ones, carried fragments of truth. So, he came to listen, not to dig. He spent his first days speaking with the elders, hearing their versions of the tale. Each one was slightly different. Some swore the old man found gold. Others said he discovered a burial site of ancient warriors. But through every telling, one thing stayed constant: the loyalty of the dog and the rancher's faith in something greater than himself. It fascinated the young man how belief could outlive the body, echoing across generations through simple acts of devotion. One evening, he decided to visit the canyon alone. The sun was setting, painting the rocks in a burning orange glow. The trail was silent except for the soft crunch of his boots. When he reached the edge, he saw it. The same hat resting on a stone, untouched by wind or time. And beside it, the old dog, older than any creature should have been, sitting quietly with eyes that seemed to hold the memory of centuries. The historian froze. The dog didn't move, didn't growl, just looked at him, deep and patient. He removed his hat, lowering his head in respect. "I came to learn," he whispered, "not to take." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the wind rose, carrying the faint echo of drums again, the same rhythm that had once haunted those who dug for greed. But this time, the sound was gentle, like a welcome, not a warning. The historian felt tears sting his eyes. He understood then, some treasures aren't meant to be owned, only honored. When he rode back to town that night, the stars above the canyon shimmered brighter than he'd ever seen. He didn't tell anyone what he saw. Not exactly. Instead, he wrote down what he felt. His journal spoke of humility, reverence, and the strange power of loyalty that transcended death. He ended his entry with a single line that would echo in every reader's soul. The old rancher was never looking for gold. He was protecting a promise older than the land itself. The historian's journals began to circulate beyond Dry Creek, passed hand to hand by travelers and wanderers who sought meaning in forgotten places. His words painted the canyon not as a graveyard, but as a living memory of faith and endurance. Soon, people from across the frontier came to visit, not to dig but to witness. They brought offerings of water, tobacco, feathers, and simple prayers, leaving them by the same stone where the rancher's hat still rested. The town, once mocked for its superstition, became a sanctuary for the weary and the lost. Among these visitors was a young widow named Clara, who had lost everything in a fire that took her husband and her home. She came seeking solace, believing the old legend might ease her grief. When she arrived, she found not gold or miracles, but silence, pure and heavy, the kind that speaks directly to the soul. As she knelt by the stone, she whispered her pain into the dust, not expecting an answer. But the wind shifted softly, and from the shadows, the same old dog appeared, sitting beside her, as if to listen. Tears streamed down her face as she reached out to touch its fur. It was warm, real. The animal looked into her eyes with the same ancient calm that had once silenced hardened men. And in that moment, Clara understood what so many before her had missed. The treasure wasn't buried. It was carried in the heart of whoever dared to believe in something greater than their suffering. She smiled for the first time in years, whispering, "Thank you," as the dog rose and disappeared back into the canyon mist. When Clara returned to Dry Creek, something had changed in her. Her sorrow no longer consumed her. It had transformed into quiet strength. She reopened the abandoned church at the edge of town, turning it into a refuge for travelers and the poor. When people asked her why, she'd simply say, "Because someone once kept a promise out there, and I won't let it die." Her words carried weight, as though the spirit of the old rancher had found a new voice through her kindness. Over time, Dry Creek became known as the town of the promise. People came not for wealth, but for healing. And though no one ever saw the old dog again, his legend remained in every whisper of wind that passed through the canyon. Parents told their children that if they listened closely at sunset, they could still hear him guarding the land, faithful as ever. One winter morning, decades later, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, and for days, snow blanketed the canyon in white silence. The townsfolk stayed inside, tending fires and praying the roofs would hold. When the storm finally cleared, a group of children ventured out to play, their laughter echoing across the frozen streets. It was one of them, a boy of barely 10 years, who saw it first. At the edge of town, right where the desert met the canyon trail, stood a shape carved in snow, a dog, perfectly still, facing the valley below. It wasn't made by human hands. Its form was too detailed, too lifelike, down to the fur lines and the raised ears. The boy called for his father, and soon the townspeople gathered, staring in silence. No one spoke, but they all felt the same thing, a warmth beneath the cold, a reassurance that some promises never fade. That night, the church bell rang on its own. Clara's son, now an old man, walked through the snow to the chapel, drawn by a strange pull. Inside, the candles had all been lit, though no one had been there to do it. On the altar lay a weathered hat and a collar, old, worn, but unmistakable. He felt his knees, tears freezing on his cheeks, whispering words his mother once told him. Faith doesn't die. It just changes form. The following morning, when the sun rose over the canyon, the snow dog was gone. Only paw prints remained, leading toward the trail and vanishing into the mist. The townsfolk didn't chase them. They didn't need to. In their hearts, they knew what it meant. The guardian had returned home, just as he always did when the land called him back. From that day on, no one ever tried to dig, search, or claim the canyon again. It became a place of prayer, where travelers would come not to seek fortune, but to find peace. Some swore they could feel a presence there, quiet but comforting, as if the old rancher and his faithful companion still walked beneath the crimson cliffs, keeping their eternal watch. And in the stillness of the desert wind, the promise lived on. Years drifted by like sand through worn fingers, and the legend of Dry Creek deepened into something more than memory. It became faith. The canyon was no longer seen as a place of death or superstition, but as sacred ground, a space where the living and the gone shared the same breath of wind. Travelers spoke of strange lights appearing at dusk, of soft howls carried over the ridges, and of a peace so profound that even the most restless hearts found rest there. People didn't fear the story anymore. They drew strength from it. The historian's old journals, now yellowed and fragile, were kept inside the chapel Clara had rebuilt. Pilgrims would read them by candlelight, tracing each line as though touching the soul of the rancher himself. Some swore the air would grow warmer when his name was spoken aloud. They called him the keeper of the canyon, a man whose loyalty had transcended death. And beside his story, they always left a bowl of water and a piece of bread for the dog who never left his side. It was during one of those quiet evenings that a drifter arrived, thin, ragged, and half-starved. He said nothing to anyone, only asked to sleep near the chapel's fire. In his eyes burned a kind of sorrow no words could explain. That night, as the others slept, he walked alone to the canyon's edge, carrying nothing but an old harmonica. He sat beneath the stars and began to play, the tune soft, broken, and haunting. The melody echoed down the cliffs like a lullaby for ghosts. As the last note faded, he saw movement near the trail, something pale against the darkness. The old dog stood there, silent and still, eyes glowing faintly in the starlight. The drifter froze, but the dog didn't move closer or farther. It simply watched him, as if seeing into his soul. Slowly, tears filled the man's eyes. He took the harmonica and placed it on the ground before whispering, "I ain't got gold or words left, just this." The wind rose gently, carrying his voice into the night. When he looked again, the dog was gone. By morning, the drifter was found asleep by the chapel steps, peaceful for the first time in years. He stayed in Dry Creek from then on, helping repair roofs, tending to the old, teaching children to read. He never spoke of what he saw, but every night before bed, he'd leave a bowl of water outside his door. Some said he heard howling before dawn. Others said it was just the wind. But those who believed, they smiled, knowing the guardian still walked among them. Decades passed, and the world beyond Dry Creek changed. Railroads crossed the plains, cities rose, and machines replaced horses. Yet, while progress swallowed much of the old frontier, the canyon remained untouched, a place the maps labeled but never dared to claim. Scholars came with notebooks, priests came with prayers, and even skeptics left with silence in their hearts. For reasons none could explain, technology failed there. Compasses spun, cameras broke, and drones lost signal. It was as if the land refused to be captured by anything that lacked soul. In the early spring of the new century, a group of filmmakers arrived, eager to turn the legend into a movie. They brought actors, equipment, and a script full of drama and spectacle. The townsfolk warned them to tread lightly, but their laughter echoed the same arrogance of those men long ago. "Stories are just stories," one of them said. But that night, while setting up camp near the canyon's mouth, their lights flickered out all at once. The wind rose, sharp and cold. Then came the sound, low, distant, unmistakable, the howl of a dog. They searched, flashlights trembling, but found nothing except a set of paw prints circling their tents. The director, shaken, called for everyone to pack up and leave at dawn. But one young woman, the lead actress, refused. She said she felt drawn to the place, like it was calling her by name. Against advice, she walked down the canyon path alone, her lantern flickering weakly. There, by the same ancient stone, she found a rancher's hat, untouched, unburied, and waiting. When she picked it up, the wind stopped. The silence was heavy, absolute. Then she heard a voice, not loud, but deep and tired, whispering through the air. "Tell it true." Her breath caught. She turned, expecting someone behind her, but saw only the faint outline of a man beside a dog, both standing at the far edge of the light. They didn't move. They didn't need to. She nodded, trembling, tears spilling down her face. "I will," she whispered back. The next morning, the film crew found her standing where the canyon met the dawn, holding the hat against her chest. She said nothing about what she saw, but when the movie was released years later, it was unlike any other. It wasn't about gold or ghosts. It was about loyalty, loss, and the invisible bond between man, land, and spirit. The film became a quiet masterpiece, and at the very end, in the final scene, a single line appeared on screen. "Some promises are kept beyond time." The movie's success brought a new kind of fame to Dry Creek. Reporters, tourists, and pilgrims began to flood the little town that had once been nothing but dust and silence. The locals were cautious but welcoming, reminding everyone who came that this was not a place to take. It was a place to listen. They spoke gently of the canyon, of the old rancher, and of the dog that still howled when the moon hung low and red. The visitors would nod politely, yet few truly understood that Dry Creek was not just part of history. It was alive, breathing through every gust of desert wind. Among the visitors was a boy named Samuel, barely 12 years old, who came with his mother after his father's death. The child had grown withdrawn, speaking little and wandering off alone. One afternoon, he disappeared down the canyon trail before anyone noticed. Panic spread through town, and men gathered torches to search the cliffs. Hours passed, but the boy was nowhere to be found, until just before dawn, when they saw him walking back up the path, calm and barefoot, holding something in his hand. It was the old harmonica, the same one left decades ago by the drifter who had once played for the ghosts. Samuel's mother wept as she hugged him, asking what had happened. The boy only whispered he wasn't alone down there. When they asked who he meant, Samuel described a man in a wide hat and a big dog who walked beside him, showing him the way back. "They said it wasn't my time yet," the boy added softly, "and that I still had things to build." His eyes shone with a strange peace that silenced everyone around. The harmonica was placed inside the chapel, next to the historian's journals, as another symbol of the promise that bound all who came. From that day on, Samuel grew into a kind, humble man, one who rebuilt homes, helped strangers, and never once took credit for anything he did. He often visited the canyon, sitting quietly at sunset, whispering words the wind alone could carry. To him, the canyon wasn't haunted. It was home. As years passed, the people of Dry Creek began to realize something profound. The legend had stopped being a story about the past. It had become a reflection of them. Every act of kindness, every show of faith, every time they helped a stranger, it was as if the old rancher lived through their hands. The canyon was no longer feared or worshipped. It was simply respected. Because they finally understood, the treasure had never been gold. It was the goodness they kept alive in its name. Time, as it always does, moved on. The world beyond Dry Creek turned to glass and metal, but the town remained suspended in its quiet rhythm, as though untouched by the rush of progress. The chapel still stood at the heart of it all, its doors open, its candles flickering. The canyon still whispered at dusk, carrying the scent of sage and the hum of eternity. And though the faces in town changed, the spirit that bound them never faded. One evening, long after most of the old generation had gone, a young girl named Lucy sat on the chapel steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. She was new to Dry Creek, her family having just moved from the city. She didn't yet understand the stories, but she felt something different about the air, like it carried a heartbeat she could almost hear. As night fell, she saw a shape moving beyond the chapel fence, a dog, large and gray, standing still at the edge of the path. Lucy smiled, thinking it was a stray, and called softly. The animal looked at her for a long moment, then turned toward the canyon, as if asking her to follow. For reasons she couldn't explain, she did. Together, they walked down the moonlit trail until they reached the same stone where the old rancher's hat once lay. The girl knelt down and placed her hand on the ground, feeling warmth beneath the cool desert soil. The dog sat beside her, silent and calm. In that stillness, she felt no fear, only belonging. When she looked up again, the dog was gone. But she wasn't alone. From somewhere deep in the canyon came the faint, soothing sound of a harmonica, playing the same melody that had once echoed there a lifetime ago. The wind brushed her face like a gentle hand, and for the first time, she understood what everyone meant when they said this land remembers. She whispered into the night, "I'll keep the promise." The next morning, townsfolk found Lucy standing at the chapel door, smiling, her shoes covered in red dust. She said nothing about what she saw, but when the sun rose over Dry Creek, its light shimmered across the canyon in a way no one had ever seen before, like gold hidden beneath the earth, rising to the surface at last. And in that moment, every soul who looked toward that light knew. The promise had not only been kept, it had become eternal. In the quiet heart of Dry Creek, the legend of the old rancher and his faithful dog became more than just a story whispered by firelight. It became a mirror of what it means to live with loyalty, courage, and faith. Every soul who walked through that canyon, every traveler who knelt by that ancient stone, carried a piece of that promise with them. The old man who was once mocked for believing in something unseen had become a symbol of what the world forgets too easily, that true wealth lies not in gold, but in the integrity of one's heart. His silence had spoken louder than all the laughter that once tried to bury him. As the years faded and the dust settled, people began to understand that Dry Creek's treasure was never meant to be found. It was meant to be felt. The canyon stood as a testament to endurance, a reminder that faith doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it waits patiently in the wind, asking only to be remembered. The dog's eternal vigil, the historian's words, Clara's kindness, the boy's innocence, the girl's courage, all were threads of the same story. A story of devotion strong enough to echo through time, whispering to anyone who dared to listen, "Keep your promise, even when the world stops believing in you." The old rancher's spirit lingered, not as a ghost, but as a quiet presence guiding every act of goodness born from his legacy. When someone helped a stranger, the wind would stir. When someone forgave, the canyon would sigh softly, as if approving. The legend had transcended the man. It had become the moral spine of a community, a song carried from one generation to the next. And perhaps, somewhere in the stillness between dusk and dawn, the faint sound of a harmonica still drifts across the cliffs, carrying the message he left behind. Promises are the true gold of the soul. And that is the truth the world often forgets, that every act of faith, no matter how small, leaves a mark deeper than time itself. The canyon, the town, the dog, the people, all became a living testament that love and loyalty never die. They only change form. Sometimes they return as a whisper, sometimes as a story, and sometimes as the courage inside you to keep believing when everyone else has turned away. That is the real treasure the rancher left behind, and it waits for anyone who still dares to believe in the unseen. If this story touched your heart, let it stay with you a little longer. Let it remind you of the promises you've kept, the faith you've held, and the love you still protect in silence. And if it moved you, share that feeling. Leave your thoughts below, like a piece of your own story added to the legend. Subscribe to the channel for more tales that carry the spirit of the old frontier, stories of hope, redemption, and faith that endures beyond time. Because somewhere out there, in the vastness of the West, another promise is still waiting to be told.